It's a long title, and one of the things I want to start by saying is that the Centre of Governance and Human Rights, where I'm based in the politics department, and Claudia, who's a colleague of mine who was in the Centre of Governance and Human Rights and now is with an organisation that's a spin out of our research, Africa's Voices. We never really started by looking at big data or at public health, but we found ourselves looking at both over time. And I think that's probably the most relevant and interesting thing that our presentation today will highlight, is that we're not coming from either a data science perspective or a public health perspective, but we're finding ourselves seemingly relevant to discussions and applications that relate to both of those. So we want to talk to you a little bit about the research and where it's come to, and especially about this spin-out non-profit research service charity, in effect, called Africa's Voices, and what we're trying to do with it. And use an example related to youth and contraception in Kenya as an insight into some of the ways that we're working. It's early days, and we're very much looking to collaborate with public health researchers and other researchers in the university and outside on pilots that allow us to test out some of our methodologies. So what we have are actually really been interested in at the Centre of Governance and Human Rights, and with very much of an Africa Global South focus, is in new communication technologies and their impact on citizen engagement in public life, in governance processes, in debate and discussion, etc. So the changing ways in which technologies of communication are enabling or not new opportunities for citizens to engage in governance processes. And what we found very early on is that despite the fetishization of new apps and a lot of the digital that's purely digital, when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa in particular, you need to take a reality check and look at what sorts of technologies and media and communications are actually in use. And we found that one of the most interesting areas to look at is broadcast media, especially radio, and the combination of broadcast media with the advent of large penetration of mobile telephony. The combination has led broadcast to be much more two-way in a way than it used to be. And so you have this really big change, especially in rural sub-Saharan Africa, where 20, 30 years ago you'd have a state broadcaster bleating out propaganda of the central capital, often in a language that was not particularly relevant to peripheral areas, rural areas. Massively changed by liberalization in many countries, not all, and the proliferation of local language radio stations and other stations in many countries. And then on top of that, the mobile phone revolution as such, which has enabled people to call in, text in, engage and debate and discuss on more local language stations, on more locally relevant topics and shows. And that's been a real interesting transformation. So we spent about the last 4 years through a range of different projects studying that transformation, in particular Kenya, Zambia and Uganda. And to sum it up all really quickly is hard, but I want to emphasize just 3 things of importance. The first was around audiences that participate and listen to these shows. And the very basic thing that we found was that the listenership to these interactive shows is very, very broad. It's very diverse, and it covers a broad demography across a range of different show types: politics, governance, development, health, music, relationships, etc. Those who participate in these shows tend to be skewed towards a particular demographic type, not surprisingly more male, younger, more educated. But that's not to say that others don't participate, which they do. But the listenership is very broad, and the reason why people gave, when we did studies, household surveys and other kinds of studies on why people engage with these shows, is because of their relevance to their lives and the fact that they thought they were educative and that they gave people a voice. So even if you have a skewed participation, you have a broad listenership that engages in these spaces as a space that they value and they think is relevant to their lives. And that speaks to one of the interesting opportunities as well as challenges. You're dealing with particular limited samples, not representative in a standard, nose counting, normal distribution approach to what the public is. But you're dealing with meaningful social spaces that people value and they engage in. So albeit as such skewed or biased, they represent a space of influence and of relevance in people's lives. And that makes them particularly important, I think, for the kinds of things that we're interested here today. The second point that really came out was that the space, albeit skewed towards certain types of participation, is also a mediated space. And the mediator here often is the presenter, the DJ, but also the radio station. And they play a role in basically convening a social space that is either more or less inclusive of different voices. So you really do see variation around the show types and the types of mediation that occurs. And this points to opportunities as well. It's not just a foregone conclusion as to who will participate. And finally, importantly for us, we found that these shows, these live radio shows in particular, are spaces that authorities actually engage with. Now they engage with them often on terms that are different to why audiences or media houses engage, and that points to some of the kind of the tensions in this space. Is that politicians think it's a space for them to go and present themselves, to legitimate themselves, to mobilize, to demonstrate their effectiveness, etc. Often they're then challenged on these shows, but that points to the interesting nature of these shows as places where encounters happen between citizens and authorities in interesting and often unpredictable ways. So alongside this research, we were doing an applied pilot that was in 9 different radio stations, local ones in 8 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, trying to see if we could do something about these discussions, these interactive discussions, such that they didn't just evaporate into thin air, but we could actually gather them as little conversations that, if you connect them together, might point to interesting things. And so we did this in a few local radio stations and ran common themes of interest to the stations around early marriage, whether people feed HIV/AIDS or malaria, and different questions that were of interest to the shows that they were running. And said, well, why don't you run the same theme for a month on these different stations in different countries, and can we come together and combine the data and find anything interesting out of that? And very basically, we did. We found it was really interesting to do it. It was a very small study, not at all something that we say was a study about Kenyans and Ugandans, but rather people in Kisumu and in Fort Portal, so very much narrower, and audiences they're in. But what it pointed to was a couple of things. The most important of which was that these shows have to be engaging, and for them to be engaging, people need to be able to express themselves. If you ask them a yes or no question or a multiple choice question and limit and constrain the way that they participate, or demand that they participate in English, or require that they remain anonymous, you're basically denying the very social space that is the space that they were engaging in the first place. It's very good for your methodology, it's very good for your ethical concerns and ease of use for you, but it's not necessarily good for the audience. So one of the basic things was actually to let people express themselves. And when they express themselves, they give justifications for their answers and why they think that, where they're from. They want to be sort of recognized on air, because voice and recognition really come together quite strongly. And they often want to greet someone, like their mother, or say that they've, that they offer their sort of services, as I'm a cleaner and I can ring you on this number if you've got some work for me. It's a social space, and you have to let it sort of thrive as a social space. What does that mean? And this is the big data sort of segue, is that if you really get this stuff going, it's a really rich source of local language, unstructured, messy data that's coming in ways that you can't really deal with very easily, often in languages that don't even have a dictionary that is very elaborate and robust with which to use standard techniques of analysis. So that the opportunity presented its dilemma, but we nevertheless proceeded with a way of trying to use this opportunity and bring to bear methodological and analytical tools to actually try and work with this data. And that's really at the heart of what we're trying to do with this non-profit that we've spun out of the research, which itself it's not a spin-outs, I think, imply a linearity, that you spin something out and it's out in the real world, and that's that really. But I think actually for us it's a source of ongoing opportunities to innovate around methodology and to be relevant to research in an ongoing way. And that's Africa's Voices, and you can look it up on the website. Now, just in terms of how we present ourselves to the wide world and the organizations we're trying to work with, we sort of bring ourselves down to 5 different things that we try to do. And this is real sort of NGO charity talk, I suppose. But it really does combine the social science elements. It's like, how do you actually reach the populations you're trying to reach and engage them in meaningful ways, such that they will express and willingly express their voices? How do you actually deliver these kind of complex research as service projects? And then how do you analyze this kind of data and amplify it? And that's what I want hopefully Claudia to speak to, as long as I've given her enough time. I'm not going to speak in detail to this slide, but just goes back to what I was saying before. What we're doing with Africa's Voices is combining sort of insights from data science. So we're working with a physicist here in Cambridge who's at the Cavendish lab that works on networks, Sebastian Arnott, and he's looked at the data that we have in terms of semantic networks. The benefit there is because it's not language driven, it allows us to curate the data and organize it in ways that aren't primarily first driven by language, given that we're working with languages that are very hard to analyze. And then we combine that with the social science stuff, which is that, what is this data? There is a social reality. As I said, it's a slightly biased one in terms of who's participating, but it's a relevant and meaningful one, so there's social influence perhaps going on. There's a conversation going on, and it's changing over time. This data is a representation of that reality in some way. How do we start to organize our thinking around making sense of that data in a credible fashion? But importantly, that's our social science and data science combinations here in Cambridge. But what we've tried to do is say, well, one of the most important ingredients here is the user. So the person who understands the context, who understands the language. And if you can curate the data in ways that allow them to discover words of interest and add them to lexicons, or to just generate hypotheses or derive insights, and then feed that back into analysis, there's kind of an engagement between the analysts and the researchers and the actual, in a sense, users who actually have a lot of the rich contextual knowledge that's important to gather insights from this kind of data. And that, for us, leads to a useful iterative process. And we've got a few pilots going at the moment, this first year of the organisation, with a few different organisations. And Claudia will talk about the World Told Story, a really interesting organisation. With UNICEF, we're doing work in Somalia, in areas that are very, very hard to reach, to understand what's happening with their polio vaccination and routine vaccination drives in terms of the socio-cultural dynamics of people's receptivity to those vaccination programs in areas that are very hard to reach with conventional research methods. And I won't mention the others in detail, but just in terms of Cambridge, we've got a study going in Uganda with researchers here in Cambridge, so Ashley Moffat, professor of in the pathology department, works on maternal health in Africa, and at Makerere University in a large maternity hospital in Kampala. And what we're trying to do is... Sorry. Yep. You've got to move on. Okay, sorry. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll leave that one and hand it over to Claudia to give the example. I'll leave it with that. She can explain this person.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm trying to be brief in 5 minutes to explain this case study. So what we try to do with Africa Voices is to understand what are the patterns of conversations and how these conversations shift over time among social demographic groups. So this example is Well Told Story. Well Told Story is a Emmy Award-winning organization, media organization in Kenya. And they have a platform that engages young people in spontaneous conversations. So this is DJB. So DJB is their hero. DJB is just a normal Kenyan, 19 years old. He just left school. He doesn't have any job, but he doesn't want to do some errands as their friends. He just decided to create a radio station, and is a pirate radio station, and he broadcasts from his bedroom. And Well Told Story just use DJB as the character that would be like a role model for these young people. DJB has other friends, as Maria Kim, Malika. So these other friends they have like special characteristics that will direct them to certain segments of the population so young people can identify with. And Well Told Story is very successful in Kenya. So it's a media organization that has a comic, like a free comic, that is distributed freely through newspapers and other mediums to young people, and has a radio program. So it broadcasts 6 times a week in 25 radios across Kenya. So DJB exists as a voice, and people, it's part of the imaginarium of young people, and also is in social media, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. And when we start working with Well Told Story is because they wanted to understand what was the impact of their work. And they were interested about the program about contraception, how young people talk about contraception. And young people can interact with DJB through the platform, an SMS platform, where they can send spontaneous messages for free. And when they send one message, that trigger a small survey that asks their social demographics, age, gender, and location. So when we start collaborating with them, the point is that they wanted to go to their donors, like Gates and other US foundations. They have like a big meeting, and they wanted to converse with donors about the impact of their work. But the way that these conversations have impact is not necessarily on the real world. So these conversations have impact in the collective beliefs of shaping these collective beliefs and these ideas of young Kenyans. So we work with them, and you analyze over 450,000 messages. Sorry, I'm going to skip. So this is just to understand the impact of Wellstar Story. So it's like 1.5 million comics released every month. And there's half of the population, Kenyan population below 25 years, they read the Shujaz comics. Shujaz is the name of the program. So the Wellstar Story has a huge database of SMSs that people send to DJB. They didn't have any clue about what these conversations were about, but they knew that there was conversations about contraception, about agriculture, about protection, and they wanted to just understand what was the conversation about contraception about, and how this conversation was evolving over time. So we create with them a lexicon. So this conversation is not in Swahili, is in a mix of Swahili and local languages. That is a cheng, is a slang that young people use. So there's no way that without looking at the messages, we would understand, or even researchers at Wellstar Story understand how these young people talk about contraception. So we create a slang that will help us to filter the messages, so to understand what was the part about contraception. So this is our data. Our data basically is like individuals sending messages, and these messages have words, and these words, they belong to different types of lexicons, and then each individual is tagged with a gender, age, and with county. And the analysis behind our insights was a semantic analysis that, as Shara mentioned, is Sebastian Hannert, is a physicist and is a fellow at King's College, who apply the same models, like physics models, to this social reality. So these words are linked to the messages. And this is a bipartite network. It's just linking words with the messages. And then if you project all these words and messages, you will see like a semantic network, a network of words. And these words are all connected through edges. These edges are multi-edges because there's several words that can belong to different messages. So each edge means that is a message. So a message is tagged by individuals with gender, age, and county. So we can filter the edges of the messages, and we can see the semantic network for a particular social demographic group. And each word, each node means that it's a word. So looking at this constellation of words, we can understand what are the lexicon words when people are talking about contraception, and we can start with a word like condom or boyfriend, and then we see what are the other neighbor words. So using this method, we can understand what are like these groups of words that have a meaning, and they create a lexicon. So this is done in an intuitive way when we work with researchers and our research assistants who speak the language, who speak Cheng, who are based in Kenya. So this is an interface that was created to analyze this type of data, this SMS data. So basically we can start with a word query like Charlie. Charlie means boyfriend. And then we see like the frequency of Charlie over time. And we can see what are the words associated with Charlie. And then we can also filter the data by the social demographic. So starting with a word, we can create a lexicon and then filter the data by this lexicon. And then look at trends over time. So I'm going to show you like one of the graphs we created for Wellstar Story. So we create two types of lexicons, one that was the slang and one that was more the formal lexicon. When people talk about contraception, when they talk about family planning, talk about health clinics and other slang when young people just ask the DJB, for example, oh, I like this girl and I'd like her to be my girlfriend, for example. So more ingenious, like more conversations with this type of more adult world conversation and more peer world conversation. So over time, if you plot them, you will see that these conversations, they start as being increasing slightly, and here they start increase, the slang conversation increase, and then became sustainable and very differentiated from the formal conversation. So there's one point here that was in September 2014 when we did this study with Wellstar Story, and we gave them insights about what were the words and in which terms people are talking about these contraceptions. And they include these insights in their comics, and they could shape the stories and the way they talk about this using the same language, and people could relate to. So apart from doing like these two different types of tracking conversations over time, we can also tag the conversations with social demographics. For example, if I filter only like what happened since June 2014, and we can see that if you look at the overall SMS database, there's a split of 60% men to 40% women. But if you filter only the data with this conversation, we can see that there's an overlap between men and women. So this is a conversation that is inclusive, is interesting for both genders. And in terms of, you can see, for example, age patterns, and we can see demographic patterns for these conversations. And just to finalize, 1 minute, I just want to say that this is, I'm sorry, 1 minute, like the challenge of this type of data. There's statistical challenges, practical and methodological challenges. So we are trying to have like a good balance between like this big data and looking at trends and looking at unique voices. And this is not easy. We need this human knowledge context to make sense of these insights. It's not only looking at these graphs. And there's a big ethical challenge that has to do with recognition. So all these messages, they contain these messages contain information that can identify people because, for example, in radio stations, it's part of the motivation of people to, yes. Okay, I will finish here. Sorry.
Thank you very much.